So we're going to talk about who can become president first, some of those like nitty-gritty details. Everything for the president is outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1 starts the description of what the president requires, what are some of the rights that the president has. Just a couple of little background things. Out of the 43 presidents, 25 have been lawyers. Many of them have been wealthy. Lots of them own their own businesses, have done work in other sectors, typically the private sector, but they also have a record in government, so they've spent some time in the public sector. The minimum age, hold on, let me make sure that this, okay, so this will tell you a little bit about some of those requirements. The minimum age is 35 years old. You have to be 35 to be president. JFK was our youngest president at the age of 43, and Ronald Reagan was our oldest at the age of 54 when he started office. The average age Ronald Reagan was the oldest at 69. The average age is 54. So we typically see middle-aged presidents. I think the 35, I would be very surprised to see a president at the age of 35 be elected. There's just not enough time for them to develop a really strong government record, but it could happen. You have to have been a resident of the United States for 14 years, and you have to be a natural-born citizen. Now, obviously, you know this. There's lots of controversy with the natural-born citizen. President Obama was repeatedly caught up in this debate about whether he was a natural-born citizen. Ted Cruz is now in the midst of that debate. The reality of it is that even if they wanted to bring this case against Ted Cruz, he would probably win it. His mom was a U.S. citizen, and he spent a great majority of his life here. So I don't think that there would be much grounds for, taking him out of the running. Until 2009, all have been white except for Barack Obama, male, and Protestant, except for JFK. So our entire line of presidents has been basically homogeneous. It's not very diverse. And the process of becoming a president, there's a piece of the 12th Amendment that you need to know that was adopted in 1804. It specifies that if there is no majority in the Electoral College to elect a president, then it goes to Congress. House of Representatives and the Senate gets to decide. So there's always that piece there that could happen. Oops. Just some background on some of these people. Harry Truman was the proprietor of a Kansas City, Missouri men's clothing store in the 1920s, and Ronald Reagan, as many know, was an actor before he became president. Lots of people have pretty varied life experiences before they become president. Also, lots of them have very varied life experiences after they become president. Some of them go back into the private sector. Some of them lecture at colleges. George W. Bush is doing art, which is a piece of his life that nobody really knew about, but he is now a budding artist, and he tends to just lie pretty low. Some presidents are more out there. Some presidents kind of go quiet. It's kind of up to their personality. Okay, so there are so many roles that the president has. So we're going to try and go through them. But one of the things you need to remember here is that this is the hardest part of being president, is balancing all of the roles that are expected of this one person in this one office. And as a people, as the American people, we're very critical of our presidents and how they spend their time in each of these roles and what they perceive or what the public perceives them doing in these roles. So the first is head of state. This is the role of president as the ceremonial head of the government. and he's sort of the face of the American government for most, everyday Americans pulled on the streets. If they are asked about an image for American government, they're usually going to bring up the president. But there are duties here in the head of state. These are things like decorating war heroes. The president throws out the first pitch of the baseball season, dedicating national parks, receiving visiting heads of state, and representing the nation at times of national mourning. So these are things that out in the public, very ceremonial, kind of showing that the president is out there. And again, we've had presidents who do this a lot, we've had presidents who haven't done it as much. And we're very critical. When we see a president do a lot of head of state things, we start to wonder, is he being, actually getting things done, and is he being effective? But then when we don't see him do head of state things, we criticize that person for not being a public president or not allowing us to see him. So it's kind of one of those catch-22s in all of these situations. The second is what we call chief of state. Or chief executive, sorry. This is that he's the head of the executive branch. The executive branch's main purpose, goal, is to execute laws that have been passed by Congress and the president. And so he does this through many different ways. First of all, he's constitutionally bound to enforce the acts of Congress, the judgments of federal courts, and the treaties signed and approved by the United States. If he doesn't do that, he can be found, he can be tried in Congress for things like that. So some of the things that he uses, first is the power of appointment and removal. Most government positions are filled by civil service, which is generally gaining government employment through a merit system, but there are also a great deal of government positions that are appointed by the president, ambassadors, cabinet level positions, advisors, anyone from the White House office, things like that. This allows him to fill positions with people that he trusts, with people that he thinks will provide him with the most information. Sometimes this works out, sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't work out, the president can remove those people. He can remove the heads of 10 executive departments, all of the cabinet secretaries, and he works with in the executive office, so he can remove anyone in that office as well. And then one of the other pieces that we put into the executive branch is the enforcement of what the federal courts do. And so this is where the president can kind of get his hands into the judicial branch. This is the power to grant reprieves or pardons. Reprieves are formal postponements of an execution of a sentence imposed by a court of law. Now, this doesn't have to be like the death penalty. It can be simply just a sentence of a jail, a prison sentence or something like that. Pardons are a complete release of punishment or legal consequences of a crime. A pardon can be granted by a president before or after a conviction. Pardons are probably the most controversial piece here. Some presidents really believe in pardons. They believe that it's a good position for them to have. Lots of presidents try not to get involved here for two reasons. First, if it comes back that this person becomes a detriment to society, it's on the president because the president's the one who released him. So that can be a bit of a problem. The second thing is that it kind of looks like the president doesn't trust the judicial branch process. And anytime that you're losing trust in one of your branches, it's hard to work with them for certain things. So lots of presidents try not to pardon. They'll pardon for specific reasons or for knowledge of other issues. Say they want that person for information regarding a situation or something like that. We do often see presidents do a few pardons on the very last day of their term. This typically is sort of one of the last duties that the president might choose to do before they leave office. This is at a G8 summit. I have this picture in your book. Okay, two more roles. First is commander-in-chief. This means that the president is in charge of all of the military. The president has the ultimate decision in military matters and has the final authority to launch a nuclear strike using missiles or bombs. If you know anything about the president, he travels with what we call the football. It is a briefcase that has all of the codes to a nuclear launch. However, the briefcase is no longer really used. Today, nuclear security codes are uploaded to a private website, which seems a little odd, but it's protected by a retinal scan technology that can only be accessed by the president. So now the president doesn't usually travel with the football. It's all digitally monitored for the president. That does mean that in wartime, the commander has a lot more powers, and part of that comes from the War Powers Resolution. This was passed in 1973, and it spells out the conditions under which the president can commit troops without congressional approval. So this is the idea that the president can commit a set of troops for up to 60 days. It can be up to 90 days if they ask for an extension without having Congress approve it. So if you remember, Congress has to approve a declaration of war. It's not just up to the president. However, with the War Powers Resolution, now the president has a great deal of power in committing troops. And we've seen presidents use this over and over and over again to sort of get involved in situations before they decide whether they want to actually declare war on a specific country. The third is a chief diplomat. This is the idea that the president has the power to go to other countries and design treaties or other agreements. Diplomatic recognition is the formal acknowledgement of a foreign government as legitimate. The president gets to decide things like that. So you all know this, hopefully. The United States did not recognize Cuba as a legitimate government for a very long time, meaning that we didn't have any economic, social, political ties with that country until about a year ago. So it's very important. It means a lot. It may not mean a lot to you, but to other countries, it does mean a lot in order to, sort of get that recognition out there. The president can also propose and write treaties. Those have to be ratified by the Senate, though. So he can't just go ahead and make all sorts of agreements. One thing that he can do is what we call executive agreements. And these are international agreements made by the president without ratification from the Senate. They don't require Senate approval, but it also means that we don't necessarily have to abide by them because they're not formally announced. It's not a binding agreement for our entire country. So we have seen executive agreements broken. Typically, executive agreements are simply built to build rapport among leaders of different countries and the president. Feeling like the president is on their side is something that can certainly help in a situation, but it doesn't have a whole lot of force of law if things got really difficult. Okay. Next role is what we call chief legislator. So obviously the president has to work with Congress. This is probably one of the more day-to-day roles that a president will use. The president works with Congress every day to make sure that policies, agendas, ideas are kind of passed through. One of the biggest pieces here is the State of the Union. We're going to watch the State of the Union next week. Sorry if you've already seen it, you're going to watch it again. This is an annual message to Congress where the president proposes a legislative program. It's not only addressed to Congress, it's also addressed to the people. It's a pretty big deal. It's the one time that the president really gets to lay out what exactly he'd like to propose. The president can write legislation. He often will do that and send it on to a congressperson to be announced into the floor. Lots of what our legislation comes from is from the executive office. Part of that is because Congress really likes to use ideas from the president, because then odds are good that the president will sign it once it gets to his desk. However, in a Congress such as today, which is divided by the president, so it's a Republican-controlled Congress with a Democratic president, we're not seeing a whole lot of legislation go through that would be in favor of things that Barack Obama would want. But he can write legislation, he can telephone and meet with various congressional leaders, he makes public announcements to influence the public opinion. He's head of the party, and he exercises legislative leadership through meeting with Congress people. Saying no to legislation. So I talked about this very briefly last unit when we were talking about Congress. The president has four main, well, actually you could kind of consider it five, options when a piece of legislation gets to his desk. First, he can sign it. Next, he can veto it. He can pocket veto it, meaning that he can leave it on his desk if Congress goes out of session. It doesn't become law. If Congress is still in session, it does become law, just doesn't have the signature of the president on it. And then the fifth part that I didn't really talk about in the last unit is what we call a line item veto. A number of years ago, I'm forgetting the president, is it Ford? Somebody really wanted the line item veto, wanted to have that power. Basically what the line item veto does is that in appropriations bills specifically, the president can cross things out, kind of alter things. The president cannot add anything. The only thing he can do is cross things out and then sign that piece of legislation and it automatically becomes law. Line item vetoing is a really difficult thing for presidents to do because it's kind of one of those low blows to Congress. It's sort of like, I'm going to do whatever I want and I'm not interested in what you have decided here. I'm going to go ahead and make a kind of unanimous decision. So it doesn't build a whole lot of rapport between the president and Congress, and so most presidents don't use it. If anything, they'll go back to Congress and say, I'd like to line item veto this. Could you edit it so that I don't have to do that? So often it's kind of used as a threat, not so much as an actual action. Congress does have the power to override a presidential veto. It's rarely used. It's pretty difficult to do, but Congress has tried many times. So this is a graph that's in your book that is sort of interesting. It's the rating of presidential success by year. One of the things that you need to see here in a trend is that the first few years of a presidency are where most of the agenda gets done, which is why you often hear, like, in the Republican debate this weekend, they said a lot of things like, in my first 100 days. First 100 days are crucial. It's where you're going to have the highest approval rating you've ever had, and it's where you have the most momentum. And so you'll often see that success happens a lot in those first few years, and then it will dramatically drop off. One of the things about President Bush that's interesting is that he had a pretty high success rate for a large number of years because of situations that happened while he was president. But then you'll see the last few years very difficult for him to get anything done. Obama has kind of faltered back and forth, but he certainly had the highest when he was first elected, and it has started to go down as things have gone by. Okay, there are other presidential powers that we need to talk about. First are constitutional powers. These are stated in the Constitution in Article 2. Statutory power is the power created for the president through laws enacted by Congress. So statutory power is what does the president have the power to do once Congress passes a law. So what kind of enforcement does he have to exercise to get things done? Expressed powers are the ones that are written right into the Constitution. And inherent powers are powers that the president derives from statements in the Constitution, such as the executive power shall be vested in the president, or that the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. An inherent power is sort of the idea that there are some powers that the president has to have in order to get his job done, and they're not necessarily written anywhere. They're not necessarily given to him in a specific manner, but they have to be there. So things like an inherent power is things like speaking to the country at any given time, issuing executive agreements, These things have to happen for the president to be a legitimate leader. Again, it doesn't really necessarily say anywhere that those are the powers that he has, but if he didn't use those powers, he wouldn't be able to do anything. So there's something to be said for kind of giving the president just a general sense of here's what you can do as president. Eisenhower, this is like a little piece in your book. It talks about this radio and television address he gave in 1959. And in that address, he called for new labor legislation to protect Americans from gangsters, racketeers, and other corrupt elements. This would be kind of a role of the president that isn't necessarily like given, it's just necessary. Okay, next role, the president is the chief of the party. The president is considered the head of the party. However, the president doesn't usually have a lot of say in that. Normally the party's chairperson, so the Democratic National Party's chairperson, probably has more of the day-to-day power, but the president is seen as the chief of the party. This means that he chooses the National Committee chairperson. He will discipline party members if they fail to support his policies. And then there are two pieces here. First is that he's a huge fundraiser for the party. He'll often do a lot of events for the Democratic Party in order to gain donations and other financial contributions. But again, that's only helpful when his approval rating is high enough. When it isn't high enough, you often won't see the party using the president because it's not a good use of their power, right? No one wants to donate to a party that has a leader that's not doing his job or not seen as doing his job. And then the second piece that the president gets to do as part of the party is what we call patronage. This is the practice of rewarding faithful party members or workers with government employment. We see presidents do this a lot. We also see presidents say things in campaigns like, I will not use the patronage system when I become president. I will simply only choose those who are best fit for the job. That's not necessarily true. There are a lot of favors that the president has to give. There are a lot of favors that you necessarily don't know about until those things happen. But there's certainly a lot here. And that can be anything from someone who's very public to someone you probably don't even know about, but certainly needed. So I'll give you two examples. First example is remember back when you watched the Hurricane Katrina mini documentary, the director of FEMA wasn't really qualified to be the director of FEMA. He simply got his job because President George W. Bush gave him patronage. Essentially, he was a faithful follower of the Republican Party. He donated a lot of money to the campaigns. He seemed to be very supportive. And so the president gave him this job. Now, it came back to bite him in the end because what we've learned is that there are some positions in the executive branch that you certainly need to have an expert in, and FEMA would certainly be one of them. But other things like President Obama, there's often talk that he elected or nominated Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State because she was running against him. And when she dropped out of the race, her team went to him and said, you know, we will happily, you know, put our support behind you if you can guarantee, you know, a really well-known position. It's funny, take a look at endorsements that candidates get. Most of the time you'll see those endorsements turn out to be positions. I really wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump becomes your president to see Sarah Palin either as the VP or as a pretty high cabinet level position. She came out right away, she's endorsed him, she's putting a lot of support behind him, lots of publicity, things like that. So you can kind of see it. Sometimes when you look at government, you can sort of see some of those things carry over. The president's power to persuade, this is huge. If the president isn't able to persuade you, he's not going to be able to be a pretty good politician. Also, you know, remember that these are all politicians. They're all telling you something and doing something else. It's just the nature of the beast. But how well is the president's ability to persuade you? This could be more obvious than if you watch the Republican national debate. On Saturday, the whole first half an hour was basically candidates trying to explain why they have the leadership skills. That's simply their ability to try to persuade you. I mean, how do you know if someone has a leadership skill to deal with things that we don't even know are going to come to us? Trust you. And then constituency and public approval. We've talked about public approval a lot when we talked about polls. Public approval for the president is huge. It means if he can or can't do his job. The president constituency is really actually more his constituents are the people in Washington, D.C. Yes, he represents you. Yes, he is your president. But really, he deals with Congress more often. And so most presidents will tell you that their number one constituency is Washington, D.C. and members in the, establishment, if you will, and how well they trust or appreciate a president. Your book mentions George W. Bush and public opinion polls. That is because after September 11th, Bush had the highest approval rating ever recorded. However, you'll see his approval ratings basically slide super fast down. By the end of his term, he leaves with a very low approval rating. So he sort of sees kind of the major spectrums of public opinion. So a couple of things about Barack Obama and popular approval. Like the graph said, he starts out with this huge approval rating. He has this huge momentum, first African-American president, a man from the Midwest. His family is very popular, but he started to sink. And one of the things that President Obama has tried to do to sort of boost his popular approval rating is to go public, which is a term that we use when a president goes over the heads of Congress and political elites and takes their cases directly to the people. We've seen President Obama do this numerous times, and it's the idea that his whole message is that Congress is too gridlocked, too partisan. He wants to change it, while meantime he's actually kind of encouraging it or buying into it. But he wants you to feel like he's your president, he's president of the people. So oftentimes he'll go and he'll give speeches and other things. He does a lot of things by executive agreement, meaning that he's going around Congress. So one of the best examples here is about a month ago, the president came out to sign an executive agreement about the gun show loophole, and he gave this pretty emotional speech about gun violence and some of the families that he's had to console over his 2 terms as presidency. And what it really did is it went around Congress directly to you. It appealed to you emotionally, it appealed to you as kind of your leader choosing to do something. But in reality, what he did is he went around a branch of government and he signed an executive agreement. And whether or not you agree with that or not, that's the bottom line, is that he could have gone through Congress. Now he didn't, because he knows that if he goes through Congress, nothing is going to come out on the other side and he won't have anything to show for it. And so he goes public. He decides that that's the choice he's going to make. And a lot of that's because he's trying to look like he's, effective in getting things done. He has to do that. If he goes through Congress, they're going to just stall things because they don't want him to seem as though he's getting things done because they're on the opposition party. So again, one of the things you have to kind of start to see as a trend here is that presidents have an agenda. They're politicians through and through. They're going to really try and get you to trust them, have an emotional connection to them. But in reality, they're just like every other politician. They're going to tell you something, they're going to do something else. Or they're going to find a way to encourage an agenda through any way possible. And sometimes that may or may not be sort of what government was designed for. And presidents do this no matter what party, Democrat, Republican, young, old. It's a very universal trait that presidents have. So sort of be aware of that when you're looking at presidents and how well they've done. Even presidents that we truly love, have done a lot of things that may or may not actually have been by the book. So I'm going to stop lecture there for today. We should definitely finish tomorrow. And then don't forget that you don't have class on Wednesday because it's an early release and we have afternoon classes.